Okay. So welcome everyone. This morning we're using the GoToMeeting webinar technology. So you should see a sidebar on your upper right corner of your screen. When you open the sidebar, there's an arrow. You can ask a question by typing it in and pressing send. So that's how we're going to kind of take the questions this morning. And so if we just, great, okay, just take it back there, fantastic. So yeah, this morning we have, my name is Richard Nolan. I head up the digital sales team here in Codec, which is very focused on delivering real business value through cloud technology and, of course, Codec's world-class services team, which I can talk about in a second. But our main presenter this morning is Eoin Barry. And Eoin will be presenting this morning. He's our practice lead for our DevOps business. So Eoin joins us after a career that spans a variety of industries which are highly reliant on developing systems which drive their business and accelerates their growth. A couple of industries like airline, Ryanair, obviously, as we all know, who are big users of technology and development. And I think Eoin spent about 2.5, 3 years there, also through banking, insurance businesses, and other software development companies. So it's great to have Eoin here this morning to take us through that. Before we kick that off, I just wanted to go through a little bit about Codec. If you don't know, this is the kind of boring stuff, but I'll fly through this fairly quickly. So we've been around for over 30 years now. We have offices throughout Ireland, the UK, Germany, and Poland. And we have pretty good revenues now at the moment of 25 million. We're a services company, so you know what we produce is services through the people and the teams within our practices, and those teams have grown now to a headcount of over 200. And to put that in context, we had about 85 staff 2.5 years ago. So it's well over double growth there. So we've had a lot of change there, particularly in the way we structure our teams and the management layer that helps those teams deliver the services that are required. We're also pretty much a multi-award winning company. We've just won the Microsoft Country Partner of the Year again for 2018, which is 2 years in a row and 3 out of the last 4 years. So I think we're certainly doing something right there, those guys. And finally, the last slide I just wanted to mention here is that obviously we've been around for a long time, and we have amassed a lot of industry know-how across a lot of different companies. And here comes some of the people that we've dealt with over those years. And most of those companies are still on our books and still working away on projects long term and across different practices. So I'm going to hand over now to Eoin, and I'll just put myself on mute, and I'll be keeping an eye out for any questions that you have and trying to answer them back for you. So Eoin, over to you.
Hello, and hi, thanks for the introduction, Richard. My name is Eoin Barry, and I'm going to be talking about accelerating your business growth through DevOps techniques. Okay, so we'll get straight into it. So what is DevOps? So DevOps is one of these terms that's kind of misunderstood quite a bit. It's kind of a broad term with kind of generic, kind of fluffy definitions like this. But basically, in a nutshell, what it is, it's a community of practice dedicated to the study of evolving, operating rapidly changing resilient systems at scale. So you're going to hear me talking about a bunch of different disciplines in a few minutes. I'll be talking about project management, software process management, software architecture, development best practices, release management, and so on. So this is what DevOps is. It's for all of these disciplines, it's a well-accepted community of best practices for those disciplines, which comes under an umbrella term of DevOps. So what kind of problems do we currently see in business, and where did this come from? So traditionally, when you're delivering software, we kind of use the waterfall model. So in this, you'd have a project which is made up of n number of features bundled together. You'd have a large requirements phase, you'd have a design, implementation, test, and release phase. And this lead time, so the lead time being the point from conception until to the release, this could span many years in some cases. So within each of these kind of phases, you'd have different functional silos. So you have project management, business analysis, BAs, UX. In your implementation, you might have front-end, back-end developers, Android, iOS, integrations, architecture, and so on and so forth. You've a bunch of specializations, a lot of departmentalization, and a lot of latency and communication across the board. So we've found over time that this is a hugely inefficient way of building software, and very often when you got into actually releasing this, you realize what you've implemented wasn't actually what the business wanted. So in the early 2000s, late 90s, there was a movement towards more agile processes, and the one that came out most popular out of this was kind of Scrum. So in Scrum, you take a feature or a group of features, you have a small inception phase, and then you've 2-week sprints where you'll have a plan, develop, test cycle, and at the end of it, you have a potentially releasable piece of software. So there's no provision for actually releasing the software in Scrum, and it's done by a separate team. It's not the development team that does this. It's the operations team. So what happens very often if you're not doing this particularly well, if you're not so mature, is that you'll go multiple iterations, multiple features, and your releases won't come out. So you have releases 3 or 4 times a year. And I've seen some cases with some organizations where you go 2.5, 3 years without releasing any software into production, which I mean, at the end of the day, if you're a business user, there's not much difference between doing something like RUP and Scrum if you're not going to see the software for years at a time. So this problem kind of gets exacerbated then by teams that are set up in this kind of legacy way where you've layered architecture on a team per layer, and then they decide to horizontally slice stories. So if you have a story for a basic feature, you might have a front-end story, a back-end story, and an integration story, for example. As I said, I've seen teams that have 6 or 7 of these layers, and you have that one story sliced 7 times and given to 7 different teams. So then you have this, you have a problem then in trying to coordinate this. It becomes hugely complex. You have things like complex branching strategies. You don't know what the release cadence is for each of these teams. Some are performing at different speeds than the other, and others have different demands, so they have bigger backlogs or more bugs or whatever. So it's extremely difficult to coordinate this. And then you've one big messy release phase at the end, which takes a lot of time. Generally, what you see in this kind of setup is you have a lot of code freezes, so points in time where you just tell your developers to down tools while you figure out all of these merges and figure out these releases. If you have a team, if you're one of these larger companies with hundreds of developers, this is extremely expensive. So DevOps kind of came around a few years ago, about a decade ago, trying to solve these problems. So one approach that works pretty well. Oh, sorry. So what's the cost of this kind of problem? I guess is the first point. So about 10 years ago, Ron Kohavi at Microsoft ran some experiments, and he figured out that 2/3 of the features developed by IT departments add either no value or a net negative value. So that means that for every feature that you decide to deliver, by the time it comes out to release, so at the end of that long lead time, you only figure out that, hang on, we shouldn't have ever delivered this. Or it has a net negative value. It's actually added so much complexity into our existing feature set that is costing us more money than if we'd never done it in the first place. So this is kind of staggering when you think about it. At the time, Netflix actually corroborated this by saying that, yeah, they found that not only 2/3 of the features developed didn't add any value, actually 90% of what they developed added no value. They found an extra 22% of unplanned work from managing these complex merges, managing branching strategies, and unplanned work coming from bugs from being set up in this way. So DevOps kind of came from this then. So there was a real need to kind of sort these problems out. And companies like Netflix really blazed a trail for it then over the last 10 years. So this is kind of an example of how you can set your team up to work in a way that kind of mitigates these problems. So if you apply kind of lean agile methodologies here, you can limit down your work in progress to a single feature for a single team. You can do just-in-time planning, where you just pull the feature and do your planning just in time before you deliver it. And at the point when you're doing the planning, then you decide on a minimum viable product. So this is the minimum viable product is kind of the minimum amount of development you can do to validate the fact that this is actually going to add business value. This is going to generate revenue and more revenue than the cost of development is worth. So here we can see that we've got develop, test, and deploy kind of verticals here. So I was trying to get the fact across that using DevOps, a lot of companies do continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous deployment. Working in this way, you decouple your deployments from release. So anytime your developer checks in, you can actually start releasing it silently into production. Then when the point that you actually meet your MVP, at the point where you meet your MVP, you can start releasing it slowly out to your user base. So for example, I might decide to release it to 1% of the Irish market and do an A/B test on it. So do some experimentation to see, is this actually worth doing? Is it worth investing that much in? At that point, then you can go through the develop. If you validate that it's actually it's worth doing, you can go through the develop, test, deploy cycle again until the feature is complete, and then pull in the next feature. So what kind of impact does working like this have on your business? So in 2017, the State of DevOps report came back with some interesting findings. On average, high performers had 440 times faster lead times for changes, 22% less time spent on unplanned work. So if you have a team of 100 developers and you're getting 22% more efficiency out of it, it's a huge return on investment. 46 times more frequent deployments, 96 times faster recovery. So if you're an online retailing presence, for example, and you go down, it's expensive to be down. So 96 times faster recovery. And the bottom line then is higher levels of customer satisfaction, because you're reacting to their needs, you're reacting to market needs, and you're getting out there as quickly as possible. Okay, so how do you make that transition from being low performers to high performers? I speak to the customers quite a bit, particularly the bigger companies, and they say, I mean, this is great in theory, but it doesn't work for us. We're a big company. We've a lot of developers. We can't do this. But we've successfully done this with bigger teams on brownfield projects, so existing software. But how do we do it? So the first thing is you really need to get rid of the functional silos. This should be your short-term goal, at least on an experimental basis. So isolating one team and just running it as an experiment to see actually what kind of return on investment can we get on this. So how do you do that? You kind of you need to map your value stream. So you need to know exactly everything that's required in order to take that piece of software out into production. So an example of a cross-functional team here, a very simple one would have some mobile capabilities, a UX guy, front-end cross-functional developers. So generalists are generally more productive than specialists. So the front end, back end thing, if you can get them to working across the entire stack, you'll find it's much more productive. If you have your team set up in a way where you've got those silos, the first step is just get the front end and back end people into the same team, working on the same product, and let them cross-pollinate. So let them start to learn the different technologies. At the end of the day, they're all developers. You pull your QA in, your BA in, and a product owner, a business stakeholder. So ideally, these teams should be co-located within the same building, in the same team, within the same part of the office. This isn't always possible, so sometimes based on the market, the IT market, it might be expensive to get these guys in. So one thing we offer is offshore teams, which we can spin up and get them to work with these best practices, who are comfortable in working this way. What we do then is we do screen sharing, get them an additional monitor, split the screen, and the guys work as if they're sitting side by side. So once we've got your cross-functional team, how do you actually align them to pieces of work? So this is a hugely complicated part of the process as well. So back in 40, 50 years ago, Melvin Conway ran an experiment. He wanted to get a compiler built. So we got two groups to work on the compiler. One group was comprised of two small teams. One group was composed of 5 small teams. The group with 2 teams made a 2-pass compiler. The group with 5 teams made a 5-part compiler. So what he deducted from this is that the organizations are constrained to produce application designs which are copies of their communication structures. So this means that if you have a team set up, there will be business logic and there'll be complexity in the piece of infrastructure or piece of software that these guys are working on. So if you have a layered architecture, for example, and you have front end and back end guys working on different teams, you'll find business logic bleeding into these teams, and you'll find complexity in there, which is a bad way of developing the software. So how do you get away from this? So the best practice here is to get that cross-functional team and assign a market orientation to them. So within every business, there are subcomponents, subdomains, sub-business domains. In the DDD world, in domain-driven design world, this is called a bounded context. So within each bounded context, you should have at least one team assigned to that bounded context. So for example, shipping, you'll have one team assigned to shipping. Within shipping, then you can find cohesive units of work, for example, shippers, orders, and statements. And these can become microservices within there, for example, if you wanted to go down a microservices route. So for each of these sub-components, you should have front end and back end and delivery pipeline for each of these. So why do that? Why introduce all of this complexity? Well, this allows you to move to release independent of each team, to release independent of each other. Not only release independent, but actually have a business stakeholder who's independent of everybody else. So if you go into the customer service business stakeholders, you have direct access to them. So this allows your teams to become in step with the business. You find that the business doesn't have to repeat the discussions that they have with 5 or 6 teams. It's just with one dedicated team. If there's a problem with team A, for example, trying to get a release out, if they've some backlog or some technical debt issues, it doesn't hold up the entire production pipeline. Everything else can be released independently of that. So there's a huge amount of value in doing this, particularly if you have a big complex project, if you're in something like banking or insurance or something like that. But there's an expense in getting there, and it's extremely difficult to get it right. So one thing that we do with our customers, we've run this dozens of times now at this stage. It's a rapid business modeling technique called event storming. So this is where you go in and you stand with one of your business stakeholders for a day, and you map out every single one of their business events that make sense to them. So a domain event being an action that happens within the business. So for example, a flight was booked or something was purchased. So you map out all of these events. You figure out what part of what subdomain of the business they live in. You can map out sub-processes. You can figure out how processes are coupled to other processes. And from there, you get a full map of your business. And again, you can map your architecture to that business. And then you start mapping things like ubiquitous language, so the business language that they speak. And once your developers kind of get this information, you start opening up the world of your developers figuring out how they can optimize your business or how they can bring in additional revenue streams. When you do this as well, you often find that looking at these processes, you can improve on them, or you can add additional ones in to realize more revenue. And one thing that we've done with a couple of business or companies here in Ireland is we've actually taken those pieces of work, revenue realizing pieces of work, and delivered it for them. Again, using all of our best practices and distributed teams. And once they're delivered, you have the ability to scale back in. So just let our guys go on to something else or move on. So given what we've gone through there, you've at the end of that process, you've kind of got your cohesive cross-functional teams abstracted away from your company. You figured out what your value stream map is, and you figured out what your business looks like. So what's next? So this is a first step on a journey. So every company that does DevOps will be doing this for years. I mean, it's something that you need to build into the fabric of your development team. But once you get to this stage, once you know what you're doing, you'll start seeing a significant return on investment. So these are all the things that we kind of do. We set up our organization and our teams in such a way that's kind of conducive to working in this way. We can do automation of your infrastructure, introduce stuff like continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment pipelines, and also go on and start bringing in software best practices. So get your guys and girls working on building quality in, so doing things like test-driven development, acceptance test-driven development, so on and so forth, and automating QA and modernizing your infrastructure and your applications and so on. So there's a huge amount of work that can happen after this, but each of them will help you realize some return on investment. Okay, so I'll hand you back over to Richard.
Great, thanks for that, Eoin. And yeah, we're right on time here. So yeah, basically that's it's pretty fascinating, and what I'm getting from that in terms of DevOps, it brings together multifaceted disciplines across business analysis, QA, quality control, project management thinking, and so on. So there's a lot to think about there. What we see as maybe a good next step for you to take if you're interested in finding out more about this with Codec is we are offering a DevOps workshop, and this is going to be held at One Microsoft Place, which is the new campus out in Leopardstown. So if you haven't been there, it's pretty impressive and well worth taking a little tour of while you're out there. And this is something that we can arrange over the next, we need to be given a couple of weeks notice and book you in for that and take it from there. So certainly guys, thanks very much for attending the webinar this morning. It's a really interesting, exciting area that we're finding a lot of companies engaging with us on, and we'd be delighted to engage with you guys as well. So I'll leave it from there. Okay, thanks a lot.